The lights died at exactly 5:17 p.m. Not a flicker, not a brownout, an absolute silent cessation that plunged 8 million people into darkness during the evening commute. The city's hum, that constant electrical thrum, vanished. Traffic signals went black, elevators stalled between floors, and the sudden silence was more terrifying than any alarm. In hospital surgical wards, the emergency generators roared to life with seconds to spare. The governor's emergency line lit up like a Christmas tree. And at the central substation, a team of young utility engineers arrived in a convoy of pristine white trucks, their tablets glowing in the unnatural dark. The lead engineer, a man named David Chen, scanned the silent control panels with a confident smirk. "Relax, everyone. It's just a ghost in the machine. The diagnostics will have this sorted before dinner." They set up their mobile command center inside the substation's control room, a bubble of light and data in the overwhelming dark. Laptops were arrayed like surgical instruments, connected to every sensor and relay in the grid. For 3 days, they lived in that room, fueled by coffee and the absolute certainty of their technology. They ran system-wide diagnostics, rebooted control nodes, and isolated grid segments. Every single reading came back green, nominal, optimal. The system, according to every piece of data they had, was functioning perfectly. The ghost remained, an invisible phantom draining the life from the city. David Chen's confidence curdled into frustration, then into a sharp, condescending anger. "The problem is in the code, not the copper," he'd snap at his team, dismissing any suggestion to physically inspect the aging infrastructure. "We're not going to solve a software glitch by poking at transformers with a stick." The governor's chief of staff called every hour, the updates growing terser, the silence on the other end more damning. They were hitting a digital wall, and with each passing hour, the city on the other side grew colder, darker, and more desperate. On the morning of the 4th day, with the situation critical, the governor's chief of staff, a woman named Maria Flores, bypassed the utility company entirely. She went down into the dusty state archives, into the basement records that hadn't been digitized. She was looking for a name, a story her grandfather had told her about the great ice storm of '87. She found it in a faded incident report, the only man who had kept the Western grid from total collapse through sheer intuition. His name was Arthur Bell. The contact number was 30 years old. She dialed it from her secure line, listening to the old-fashioned ring. A man answered on the 4th ring, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that sounded like it came from the earth itself. She explained the situation, the city dark, the engineers stumped. There was a long silence on the other end, filled only by the faint sound of a radio playing classic, country music. "They're looking at their screens," the voice finally said, not as a question but a statement of profound sadness. "And the city is still dark." Another pause. "I'll take a look." An hour later, an old pickup truck, its paint faded by decades of sun, navigated the darkened streets. Inside, Arthur Bell wore a simple flannel shirt and worn jeans, a heavy leather tool belt coiled on the passenger seat like a sleeping serpent. He drove without urgency, his eyes taking in the strange, silent city, a map of a crisis he understood in his bones, not on a screen. He was going to the heart of the failure, to the substation where the light still blazed and the answers were still nowhere to be found. The old pickup truck rolled to a quiet stop just outside the substation security perimeter, its engine cutting with a soft sigh. Arthur Bell stepped out into the unnatural quiet, the heavy leather tool belt slung over one shoulder. He looked less like a savior and more like a man who had come to read the water meter. His hands, thick and calloused, held a simple analog voltmeter, its glass face scratched and its dial worn smooth from a lifetime of use. He moved toward the command post with a slow, deliberate gait, his eyes not on the frantic engineers, but on the silent transformers and humming lines that surrounded them. David Chen noticed him immediately, his lip curling in undisguised contempt. He strode over, blocking Arthur's path. "Can I help you? This is a restricted emergency site." Arthur simply looked past him, his gaze sweeping the substation yard. "Governor's office sent me. Name's Bell." David let out a short, humorless laugh. "Right, of course they did. because what we really need right now is a walking history lesson." He gestured broadly at the high-tech command center. "We've got spectral analyzers, real-time load monitors, and a teraflop of processing power dedicated to this problem." "What exactly is that?" he asked, pointing a dismissive finger at the analog meter in Arthur's hand. "That's for listening," Arthur said, his voice quiet but firm. The other engineers, drawn by the confrontation, began to gather. A few snickered. One young woman whispered, "Is he for real? Looks like he time-traveled from a garage sale." David played to his audience, his voice dripping with condescension. "Listening? We don't need to listen, old man. We have sensors that can detect a millivolt drop from a mile away. We need data, not folk remedies." He took a step closer, invading Arthur's space. "This isn't a job for a handyman. We're dealing with a complex systemic failure. So why don't you go back to whatever retirement home you wandered out of and let the professionals handle this?" The public humiliation was complete, a performance of arrogance for his team. His final order was delivered with a cold, crisp authority. "Security, escort this gentleman off the premises, now." As the security guard approached, Arthur's hand tightened around the familiar, worn handle of his voltmeter. The bright lights of the command trailer, the smug faces of the engineers, the sterile hum of computers, it all dissolved. The world snapped into a different kind of dark, a different kind of cold. He was no longer 72. He was 35, and the air was thick with the smell of pine and freezing rain. The great ice storm of '87. The world was a crystal tomb, power lines snapping under the weight of the ice like gunshots in the silent woods. His crew was pinned, their trucks useless, miles from the nearest working substation. They had diagnostics too, clipboards and schematics that were instantly rendered meaningless by the sheer scale of the devastation. The rulebook was useless. So he threw it out. He'd built a hot stick from a fiberglass pole and some scrap copper to safely test lines that were down but might still be live. He'd diagnosed a failing substation transformer not by its error code, but by the specific sour smell of its overheating oil, a scent he'd learned to recognize years before. He'd rerouted power through abandoned feeder lines by memory alone, by feeling the load and the hum of the wires, bringing heat and light back to a neighborhood just as a newborn was entering the world in a house lit by candles. The weight of that experience was a physical thing in his hands, etched into the scars on his knuckles, coded into the custom notches on his tools. He had saved thousands that night not with processing power, but with presence. He had listened to the grid's agony and answered it. These kids in their clean vests, they saw a network, a system of inputs and outputs. They were missing the soul of it. They were missing the fact that this massive humming beast of steel and copper had a heartbeat, a rhythm, a language of stress and strain that you could only learn by standing in the rain and feeling it. The memory vanished as quickly as it came, leaving him standing there, an old man being dismissed by a boy who thought a full signal bar was the same thing as understanding. The security guard's hand was on his arm, ready to lead him away, just as another vehicle, its sirens silent but its lights flashing, screeched to a halt at the gate. The governor's black SUV skidded to a halt just inside the gate, its doors flying open before the vehicle had fully settled. Out stepped Maria Flores, the governor's chief of staff, her face a mask of cold fury. She was followed by a state police captain. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, the arrogant engineer, the humiliated old man, the security guard's hand on his arm. Her voice, when it came, was a whip crack in the tense air. "Take your hand off him, now." The security guard immediately recoiled. David Chen's smug expression faltered, replaced by confusion. "Ms. Flores, I can explain. This individual was disrupting a critical operation. He has no clearance, no modern certifications. We're dealing with a highly complex... You're dealing with a problem you created." She cut him off, her words precise and icy. "Your arrogance has left 8 million people in the dark for 4 days. Your highly complex diagnostics have diagnosed exactly nothing." She turned her back on him, a gesture of such complete dismissal it was more devastating than any shout. She faced Arthur Bell, her demeanor shifting to one of profound respect. "Mr. Bell, on behalf of the governor and the entire state, I apologize for this reception," David sputtered. With all due respect, who is he? What are his qualifications? We have protocols. We have systems. Maria turned back to him, and this time her fury was no longer contained. It was a glacial, terrifying thing. His qualifications, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper that forced everyone to lean in to hear. His qualifications are written in the lights of every home he kept powered during the '87 storm while you were learning your ABCs. His systems are the ones he built from scrap metal when the rulebook failed. His protocol is the intuition that comes from 50 years of listening to things you only know how to monitor. She took a step toward the stunned engineer. While you've been staring at green screens telling you everything is fine, Arthur Bell was the one who designed the fail-safe relay on the Western grid. That's the only reason we didn't have a cascading failure that would have blacked out half the country. The Bell Lock. They named it after him. It's in your textbook. Chapter 12. The rebuke was absolute. The other engineers looked at the ground, their earlier smirks replaced by a dawning, shameful understanding. David Chen's face was ashen. He had not just insulted an old man. He had dismissed a living legend, a cornerstone of the very system he claimed to master. The vindication was total. Maria's final words to him were not shouted, but they landed with the force of a hammer. You are relieved of command. You will assist Mr. Bell in any way he requires. You will not speak unless spoken to. Your only job now is to watch, and if you're very lucky, to learn. The confrontation was over. The air, once thick with arrogance, was now charged with a different kind of electricity. Anticipation. Arthur Bell gave a small, almost imperceptible nod to Maria Flores, a silent thank you. Then he turned his back on the command center, on the glow of the laptops, on the stunned silence of the engineers. He walked away from the light and into the deep shadows of the substation yard. He didn't look at a single schematic. He simply stood there for a long moment in the quiet dark, his eyes closed, his head tilted slightly. He was listening. The night had its own sounds, now that the human chatter had stopped. The faint, high-frequency whine of capacitors, the deep, resonant hum of transformers under no load. The sigh of the whine through the latticework of steel towers. To the engineers, it was noise. To Arthur, it was a symphony, and he was listening for the one instrument playing out of tune. He began to walk a slow, deliberate perimeter, his worn boots crunching softly on the gravel. He passed banks of switches, massive circuit breakers, his hand occasionally reaching out to brush against a steel support, feeling for a vibration that shouldn't be there. David Chen followed at a distance, a ghost himself now, humbled and silent. He watched, bewildered, as the old man stopped, knelt, and placed his ear against the side of a massive oil-filled transformer. He saw him take a deep breath, not of air, but of the atmosphere around the equipment, smelling for the faint acrid scent of ozone that precedes an arc fault, the sweet smell of overheated insulation. He was diagnosing a billion-dollar grid with his senses alone. Then Arthur stopped. He was standing before one of the oldest transformers in the yard, a hulking beast from the '60s. He held up a hand for absolute silence. His eyes were fixed on a specific bushing where the main feed entered the tank. He unrolled his leather tool belt on the ground. Among the ordinary wrenches and drivers was a single, bizarre-looking tool. It was a long, insulated rod with a custom-forged head, a combination of a wrench and a gauge, its surface pitted and welded in places. It was ugly, inelegant, and beautiful in its purpose-built utility. David stared at it, this artifact from another age. Arthur fitted the tool onto a large recessed nut on the bushing assembly, a component so routine it was never even included in diagnostic checks. The engineer's sensors would have reported its temperature as ambient, its electrical signature as nominal. Arthur braced himself, took a firm grip on the custom tool, and applied pressure. It wasn't a forceful jerk, but a steady, practiced turn, a fraction of an inch. The sound was not dramatic. It was a deep, solid thunk from within the transformer, a sound of something heavy and mechanical, settling into its proper place after being almost, but not quite, where it belonged. Arthur removed the tool and stepped back. For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. Then, with a deep resonant groan that built into a healthy, powerful hum, the transformer came back to life. The sound was picked up by the next transformer, and the next. A wave of power, silent and invisible, rushed out from the substation through the arteries of the city. Across the darkened metropolis, a miracle occurred. A traffic signal at a gridlocked intersection flickered, then glowed red. A light appeared in a 20th-floor apartment window, then another, and another. The city began to sparkle back to life, streetlight by streetlight, block by block, a breathtaking reverse sunset of human civilization. Inside the substation, the control panel alarms that had been stubbornly silent for days now chirped once, then displayed a barred new message across every screen. System nominal. Grid stabilized. The engineers stood in stunned, utter silence, staring first at the screens confirming the impossible, then at the old man who was calmly wiping his hands on a red shop rag and coiling his tool belt. He had fixed in 30 seconds what their technology couldn't solve in 4 days. The quiet dignity of that moment was louder than any triumph. He had not been proven right. The truth he carried had simply been acknowledged. The fallout was quiet, but absolute. David Chen was not fired. That would have been too simple, too clean an escape. Instead, he was reassigned. His new office was a folding chair at a field training center for new apprentices, where he was tasked with observing, not instructing. He was a living cautionary tale, a monument to the cost of arrogance. The governor's office, in partnership with the utility union, established a new program, the Legacy Lineman Initiative. Retired masters like Arthur Bell were brought back not as laborers but as consultants, their wisdom and instinctive knowledge formally recognized as the critical asset it was. Their experience became required reading. A formal letter of apology, signed by the governor and the CEO of the utility company, was delivered to Arthur's small workshop. It thanked him for his service and his patience. He read it once, nodded, and placed it on a shelf next to a jar of rusty bolts, giving it the same quiet consideration. The real change came weeks later, on a rainy Tuesday evening. The door to the local union hall creaked open, and David Chen stepped inside. He was out of his company polo shirt, dressed in simple jeans and a jacket. He stood awkwardly just inside the door, the smell of stale coffee and old wood filling the air. Arthur Bell was at a corner table with 3 other retired linemen, a complicated-looking knot of spliced cable between them, a puzzle they were solving with their hands and a lifetime of shared understanding. Arthur looked up, his eyes meeting David's. There was no surprise in them, no lingering anger, just a calm assessment. He gestured with his chin to an empty chair. David approached slowly and sat down. He didn't offer another apology. The words would have been meaningless. The silence stretched, filled only by the soft clink of tools and the murmur of the other old men. Finally, David pointed a hesitant finger at the tangled cable. "I never learned how to do that by hand," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We always used a fusion splicer. It's all automated." One of the other retirees chuckled softly. Arthur picked up a length of the cable, his thick fingers moving with a gentle precision. "The machine makes a perfect connection," he said, his low rumble filling the space between them. "But it doesn't tell you why the cable failed in the first place. It doesn't feel the tension or see the wear. Your hand does." He held the cable out, toward David. "This is where you listen for the story of the fault." David reached out, and for the first time, he took hold of the problem not with a sensor, but with his own hands, ready to learn the language he never knew existed. The lights stayed on across the city that night, and every night after, a silent testament to the quiet mastery that works in the dark. If this story of unassuming valor moved you, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to The Quiet Professionals for more tales of those who serve in the shadows.